It's with great pleasure that I introduce Professor Daniel Brunstetter, who is Associate Professor in Political Science at UC Irvine. Dr. Brunstetter is currently our UCEAP Faculty Director in France and was previously our Campus Faculty Director. Daniel received his bachelor's degree in philosophy and Spanish from Hartwick College. And as an undergraduate, Daniel studied abroad in Mexico, Peru, and Russia. He received his master's degree in Latin America studies from Tulane University and a second master's in philosophy of social sciences from the London School of Economics, and then his PhD in political science from UC Davis. While he was completing his PhD, Daniel received a Chateaubriand Fellowship that was sponsored by the Embassy of France. And it's a fellowship that aims to foster transatlantic Franco-American relations among academics and students. Daniel shared that one of his most memorable French experience was a 3-hour lunch where the rule was that one had to speak in the subjunctive. So if time were to allow, perhaps you could share a bit of that experience, Daniel. Professor Brunstetter is a prolific writer whose research interests span the historical to the contemporary and is centered on the intersection between identity, war, and peace. I thought you would be interested in some of the types of his academic publications that reflect the scope of his research interest. Just and Unjust Uses of Limited Force, a moral argument with contemporary illustrations. And this is a book that's coming out this year, published by Oxford University Press. The Ethics of War and Peace Revisited, Moral Challenges in an Era of Contested and Fragmented Sovereignty. It's an edited book that's published by Georgetown University Press 2018. Clashing Over Drones, the Legal and Normative Gap Between the US and the Human Rights Community. This is an article that's been published in the International Journal of Human Rights. And then just a few titles from book chapters. In Defense of Jus ad Vim, Why We Need a Moral Framework for the Use of Limited Force. And the Olive Tree Initiative, Lessons Learned About Peace Education Through Experimental Learning. I remember, Daniel, in one of our first interaction when I visited UC Irvine as UCEAP's Associate Dean, I think that was about 6 years ago, we discussed your work on this initiative. And if there's time later in the Q&A session, I'm sure that everyone would love to hear about this particular initiative. As for Daniel's personal interests and hobbies, he loves cooking, gardening, and working with Moroccan tiles. He relayed that he was too busy, or he is too busy with his young children to currently take up any new hobbies, though he has been perfecting his coloring skills and enjoying storytelling. Daniel's talk today is titled 1776 and All That, What Benjamin Franklin Can Teach Us About Reading History. Thank you, Daniel, for taking the time out of your very busy schedule to participate in our UCEAP Presents series. We very much appreciate it. Let's give him a big UCEAP virtual welcome, a Zoom clap icon. All right, here you go, Daniel.
Thank you, Hsiu-Zu, for the warm welcome. Thank you, everyone, for joining me this evening in France. I hope the sound is okay, the light is okay. I'll forewarn everyone that my kids, 5 and 9, might come bursting in at any moment, in which case you'll get to hear their own impressions of 1776 and all that. So I do apologize in advance if that happens. Otherwise, you'll have the great pleasure of meeting Anouk and Moira, my 2 young daughters. I want to begin this talk with a moment of reflection. It is Black History Month, and I think that it is important for us to reflect on where we are, each of us in the world, and how our place in the space that we inhabit intersects with the long history of slavery. And in my particular case, I'm residing in Bordeaux. And Bordeaux is a city on the Atlantic coast that was for over a century part of the transatlantic slave trade. And at least, and probably many more than 150,000 slaves were transported across the Atlantic. And so before we even begin, I want us to take a moment for each of us to reflect. And before you see some images that are memorials in the city of Bordeaux, as the city of Bordeaux itself reflects on its own legacy with slavery. And I think it's important for each of us to take a moment to reflect on that before we even begin the proceedings. So let's take a few seconds. My talk today is entitled 1776 and All That, What Benjamin Franklin Can Teach Us Reading History. So I came to this idea because I wanted to engage with the initial early encounters between France and the fledgling United States. I wanted to understand how that relationship was formed, what the connections were, and how we could understand that relationship, that transatlantic relationship moving forward. And it's a complex story, but one of the figures that stood out in this story was Benjamin Franklin. And I was thinking about Franklin because Franklin was the first American ambassador, diplomat to France, beginning in 1776, and he served from the beginning of the American Revolution through past its end to 1785. And so I wanted to really delve into Franklin's relationship with France, his past connection with the American colonies, and his identity as a founding father. And sort of, I wanted to read Franklin, or return to Franklin, as a response to what many of you might have seen enter the news on Martin Luther King Day during the last weeks of the Trump administration, this report called the 1776 report. The 1776 report was a report that was sought by the Trump administration to set out an educational paradigm that young Americans should follow to understand our past history. It has since been shelved by the Biden-Harris administration, so it's now a document of history that each of us can consult if we want. In fact, while I was doing research for this talk, the report disappeared from the American government website. And so now it's archived as a part of American history. And I wanted to look at this report, and if you're interested in my full rebuttal of the report, we could talk about that in the Q&A, or I can set up a Zoom meeting with any of you to talk about why I think actually the report is not a proper way to teach American history. But I wanted to take for the purpose of this talk from the beginning, the report at what it asks us to do. And it says, the principles of the American founding can be learned by studying the documents. So what happens if we go back and we actually study the documents? What do we learn and what do we see? And again, the purpose of the focus of this talk is to look at Benjamin Franklin and his relationship with France and what that can teach us, I think, about reading history. And so I want to go back in the next, let's say, 30 minutes or so to talk about what Benjamin Franklin, if we read the history, if we really pay attention to the documents, what it can teach us. But before we even do so, if we actually start to read the documents, before we even get to Benjamin Franklin, who, by the way, was never president of the United States, we will find that 11 of 15 presidents of US presidents before Abraham Lincoln owned slaves. Now, let's just take 30 seconds. Each of you get a piece of paper, open up your iPhone, don't look on Wikipedia, and let's go through the list of the first 15 American presidents. How many can we name, and how many of them, and I've given you the answer actually, own slaves? Let's do it. I'll count down in my head in French. 10 seconds. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. So, how many of you got the 11 presidents who owned slaves, who formerly owned slaves? George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, John Quincy Adams, a staunch abolitionist, is complicated because he actually didn't own slaves, but he used slaves when he was in the White House. Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, Willie Henry Harrison, John Tyler, James Polk, Zachary Taylor, and that's the list. But if you go past Abraham Lincoln, you could actually add Andrew Johnson and Ulysses S. Grant, who formerly owned slaves. So that's a pretty deep connection to American slavery. And Benjamin Franklin actually plays part of that. We're going to touch on this a little bit in our talk today. Franklin is a complicated figure. He was a printer. He owned the Pennsylvania Gazette. He was a slave owner. He had several slaves during his lifetime. He was the founder of the first American public library, a famous inventor. You all know the story probably of lightning and the key. He was a scientist, a philosopher, a politician. He helped to draft the Pennsylvania Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And late in his life, toward the very end of his life, scholars put it somewhere around 1772, but we find more textual evidence in the late 1780s that he was an anti-slavery advocate. So how do we make sense of Franklin? I think if we really engage Franklin, we can try to ask ourselves, how does someone of Benjamin Franklin's stature change over his lifetime? Who does he start out of, and how does he become toward the end? And what does that tell us about how we try to understand American history? And I'm going to tell that story. I'm going to weave it into a connection to France, and then I'm going to bring it back to Bordeaux. And we're going to talk about all the things I said in the summary of the talk. And so we're going to try and do that in 30 minutes. So Franklin was the first technically minister to France, because there wasn't the idea of an ambassador yet. But he went to France in 1776 at the dawn of the American Revolution, because he needed to help get France on board with the American Revolution. So this was the France of the monarchy. We're not yet at the time of the French Revolution. It's France that's imbued with these new ideas, these ideas of the Enlightenment. And France is a great enemy of Great Britain. And so Franklin goes to France, and he wants to try to convince the king to give money, troops, armament, military leadership, and that's going to come in the form of General Lafayette, who many of us have heard. Lafayette, by the way, is a really interesting figure because he comes out as an American hero. He's an aristocrat who comes to the aid of George Washington, and we see his name actually resurfacing in World War I and World War II. The American veterans, and one of my grandfathers actually, who served in the French campaign in World War II, they hailed their savior of France as repaying the debts of Lafayette from back in the American Revolution. And what Franklin was trying to do is he was trying to get the French military support for this American endeavor of revolution from Great Britain. And naval support, as it turns out, would be really, really important. So that's what Franklin went to France to do, starting in 1776 over the course of the entire revolution. The revolution was essentially from 1775 to 1783, and Franklin stayed a few years after. So why Franklin? Why Benjamin Franklin? Well, it's because Franklin was a philosopher. It's because he was a politician. It's because he was an inventor. It's because he was this amazing figure that captured the French imagination. And so here's the Marquis de Condorcet, who was a really important French philosopher at the time, describing who Franklin was. And this is, by the way, published in 1791. So it's at the event of Franklin's death. So one of the traditions in France at the time was to always publish these éloges, these sort of grandiose discussions of important figures when they died. And so Condorcet had this eloge of Franklin, and he said, at his arrival, he became an object of veneration for everyone who was enlightened, who was intelligent. Every party people had to go to, he was this new person from America, and who wanted to be, he wanted to get everyone to become part of a partisan of the American Revolution. The Marquis de Condorcet understood what Franklin was there for, and Franklin had to interact with all the intellectuals of France to try to curry favor with the French government to come to the aid of the Americans in the Revolution. That was his job, that was his goal. How did he do it? Well, the first way he did it is he did it through science. One of Franklin's most important intellectual pillars of his reputation was that he was a scientist. And again, we all know the story of Franklin and electricity, and that's one of the stories about him, of this larger than life figure that's been told down. But I want to just sort of bring to the conversation one of the conversations that's very prevalent with my 5-year-old at the table. She's passing through this phase, and if you might have had children know that children pass through this phase about breaking wind. How should we say? That's the way Franklin speaks of it. And, Franklin during his time was invited to many, many different meals, and he was always eating and drinking and being merry. And he decided to write to all of his scientific friends, and he wrote this letter to the Royal Academy of Brussels about breaking wind. And he wanted to do some scientific experiments about how we could change that sort of element of our anatomy. And it was a really humorous piece that gained him great fame while he was in France, but it was also the side of the scientific Franklin. And I only bring it up for the sake of humor because it's a common conversation that I have with my 5-year-old. But anyway, moving on to more important things with Franklin. He was really there for statesmanship. He was there to convince France to recognize American independence and conclude an alliance with the 13 colonies. And he did so on February 6, 1778. And part of what he did is he was going to all these different parties, these events. He was always invited. Now, Franklin's French wasn't great. It was passable. And so he played it off as sort of this silent philosophic type. And he was able to entertain people with only choice words, but deeper understanding. Because we all know that when we study abroad, our language acquisition comes first through our passive listening and understanding, and then we become more familiar with the language. And he had this to say in one quotation from a letter. He says, "If you Frenchmen would only talk no more than 4 at a time, I might understand you and not come out of an interesting party without knowing what you're talking about." I can say that in this instance, I actually feel as though he's one of my compatriots in some of the French get-togethers before social distancing and the fact we've all been locked down. But when we used to go to French parties with 4 or 5 people talking at a time, it was hard to follow the conversations. But Franklin was there for statesmanship, and he went to all these parties and these events in order to become an intellectual influencer during his time as American ambassador. Okay. And so he actually succeeded at this. And it's quite an extraordinary story. He was this larger than life figure who convinced the French king to go into debt against their greatest enemy, the British, to help the Americans in what seemed like a hopeless cause. And starting in 1781, the tide of the revolution starts to change. The Battle of the Chesapeake, when the French come to the aid, the famous Battle of Yorktown, we all have read about in our history books, those were won with French naval aid. And so this is when the revolution starts to change. It starts to shift in the tide of the American rebels. And Franklin in France, he's starting to see the fruits of his endeavors come to ripeness. And yet the war drags on. And so in 1782, Benjamin Franklin has had enough. He's been receiving letters from friends. He's receiving news. It takes a long time for things to come across the Atlantic Ocean, mind you, but he's also in correspondence with many of his scientific friends from Great Britain. And he's hearing about the death and the massacres and the destruction and the number of people who are dying, and he's had about enough. And he's starting to wonder about, is it really worth fighting this war? What are we really in it for? Why are we waging this revolution? And so Franklin takes part in what can only be described as fake news. And so I'm going to talk about this a little bit in detail. And he prints, Franklin was a printer. And so he had this Pennsylvania Gazette, and that's how he made his fortune. By the way, the Pennsylvania Gazette is a disturbing newspaper because it had the news of the day. And if we go back and we can see it on some of the archives, it had all the sort of interesting events that happened in Pennsylvania during the 1700s. And if you read through it and you read into the advertising section, what you might see is an advertisement of the most recent books that came across the Atlantic from Europe. And you might see one of the books that Franklin himself was interested in. That would be Michel de Montaigne's essays, which I'll come to later. They came across, and Franklin notes it in one of his papers. But you will also see advertisements for runaway slaves. And that's the stark reality of Pennsylvania during the 1700s. It was a free state, and yet Franklin in his newspaper was printing ads giving a reward for people to recover runaway slaves. And so it wasn't until the 1770s that Franklin starts to shift his tone from a slave owner to someone who becomes more in favor of anti-slave rhetoric. But we'll come to that in a second. But what I want to talk about now is his time as French ambassador, and he prints this supplement, and it's fake news. It's totally fake. And I want to juxtapose it just for a second. I'm going to step back to the 1776 report. If you've read the 1776 report, you will have noticed that it goes through great lengths to talk about women, to talk about Blacks, but it says only one thing about Native Americans. And it's a quote actually from an article that Franklin himself drafted. It's a quote from the Declaration of Independence. I encourage you to go and read it and search it. And this will be the only reference you actually find to Native Americans in the 1776 report, which is purported to teach us about our own history. And it's this quote from the Declaration of Independence. It's basically Franklin and his compatriots saying that Great Britain has asked the Native American tribes, the merciless, quote unquote, Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions, to raid havoc on American colonists on the frontiers. And so that's the 1776 report, its only instance of talking about Native American populations. Franklin in 1782 uses the same othering rhetoric of Native populations. He basically portrays them as exactly how he described them in the Declaration of Independence. And he uses it as fake news to try to convince his British compatriots to end the war. Here's how he does it. I'll let you read it. It's a long letter. It's a fake letter, supposedly written by a British officer, printed in Franklin's own press. He was a printer, so he had his own press in France, in Paris, on the outskirts of Paris. And he circulated this fake document. It looks like this. Remember, you see the supplement on your right-hand side. It looks like it's a newspaper, and he circulated amongst his friends in Great Britain and amongst his friends in the colonies. And he basically says that, do you really want to be associated with these massacres and butcheries? And I'll let you read through it. It's a shocking display of his regard for Native populations. We're going to come to what that means in the long term in a second. Now, if you're interested, I can talk to you a little bit about the heritage of Native American tribes. Specifically, where I grew up from is Iroquois country in upstate New York. And they had very important and distinct rules of warfare that were different from European rules, but they had their own logic, and we can talk about this stuff. But Franklin was trying to create a sense of fear and shame in his British counterparts. And so he sent this and circulated amongst them in the hopes that it would sway public opinion against Britain continuing to fight in the American Revolution. It's hard, and by the way, you can find this on the American government's webpage. I believe it's on the CIA webpage. That's where I found it. So if you want to look for it, if not, I can send you the link. There's a whole interesting story about it if you want more information. But it's unclear whether or not it had an effect, but this did eventually lead to a shift in the disinterest in Great Britain's public to wage the war. But I want to juxtapose this slide of dried scalps with what George Washington was doing. And so I want to focus specifically on the Iroquois Campaign in 1779. It's the Sullivan Campaign against the Iroquois. And this was taken a direct order from George Washington in the middle of winter of 1779. And if any of you have been in upstate New York, you know that the winters in upstate New York are frigid and cold, and they last, having grown from my own experience, up to 7 to 8 months. And so this was Washington's order. He's asking General Sullivan to go in and destroy Iroquois villages. So I find it interesting that Franklin talks about the savagery of native populations, and yet doesn't understand the savagery of the American revolutionaries themselves. And so just think about what Washington, who's, by the way, known as he who destroys villages, Hanandagayas, according to Iroquois language, from, again, where I grew up in my formative years. And I bring this because I really want us to complicate Benjamin Franklin as a figure. As a founding father, yes, he has this larger than life story, but if we're really to actually read, as the 1776 report suggests, the historical documents, very quickly we're going to find that he doesn't actually fit that image. And he's a very complicated figure that the more we read, the more we need to uncover. So just let me move this slide. My computer's having some issues. There we go. Okay, and so now let's go back to Franklin. So Franklin may or may not have been aware of what was happening in the Americas with regards to the revolution and how it was turning out. He was busy in France, again, trying to gain the favor of the French. Let's step back again and look at sort of Franklin the intellectual, Franklin the person, Franklin the persona. All of you, I'm sure, have a to-do list, right? Raise your hand. How long is your to-do list? Mine's like that long. It always keeps getting longer. It's width and length and diagonal. There's, the example of the to-do list, right? Well, you can blame Benjamin Franklin for that list, actually. In his famous autobiography, which maybe some of you have read, it was a required reading when I was in high school. There's actually a point where he tells us how we can become more virtuous people. And he tells us that we need to go through this routine of a day and have a list of things that we need to do. This was pretty revolutionary at the time. It may haunt us now because our to-do lists are forever growing, but this was novel for the time. And so Franklin has this to-do list. And so under work, you will see I've sort of listed writing scientific treatises. And so we can imagine what those treatises were and how we might converse about them with our other intellectual friends or colleagues. And then sort of, read or overlook my accounts. And so read for leisure, and, one of the things, and I'll get to in a second, that Franklin was reading, he was reading the essays of Michel de Montaigne. Michel de Montaigne is one of the major figures of Bordeaux. And so that's one of the things I'm trying to connect Franklin to, is to French history and to Bordeaux. And so we'll come back to Montaigne in a minute. But Franklin was an avid reader of Montaigne. If you're interested, I can share an article I wrote about that. And so during his leisure time, he was probably reading his essays. And then he was back to work again. He was currying favor with the French to win the revolution. And then at night, he was eating, drinking, and being merry because he didn't have to worry about social distancing and a curfew at night like we are all living in France right now. But that was his sort of to-do list. Oh, by the way, sleep at 1 a.m., by the way. Very important. So that was his to-do list. So let's return our focus to Montaigne for a second, right? Okay. Montaigne was a really, really important figure. for France, for French history. He's one of the three M's, that's actually the European way of doing three, M's of Bordeaux, Montaigne, Montesquieu, and Mauriac are the three M's. And if you come to study abroad in Bordeaux, and if you come to visit us in Bordeaux, we're going to take you to Montaigne's Chateau, Montesquieu's castle, and Mauriac's house. And we're going to tell you all about why these three M's are the most important M's you'll ever meet in Bordeaux. And so he was an important French writer. He wrote these essays, which were hugely influential in French political thought. And they were influential in Franklin's life. But before we get to that, we need to go back to Montaigne's time, because I think it's important to understand Montaigne's life to understand how Franklin received them. And so in the description of the talk today, I promised you a bit of plague, unfortunately. I'm not talking about COVID, but I'm talking about Montaigne's time. In 1785, Montaigne was living in Bordeaux, actually on the outskirts, and Bordeaux was stricken with the plague, and it killed roughly 1/3 to 1/2 the population. And Montaigne writes in a letter that he's supposed to attend an election. He was mayor at the time, and he was supposed to basically sign the document of his successor. And he talks about the plague, and he says he doesn't want to go there because he doesn't want to be exposed to the plague because he's coming from pure air. So he was definitely sort of curtailed in his movements by this historical pestilence. But there's something more that happens during Montaigne's time, and that's civil war. During Montaigne's time, there were no less than eight civil wars. And these were wars between Protestants and Catholics. They were religious civil wars. And so this is a letter dated again, 1785, which he's essentially out on the river trying to scout out armed men who are coming to harm constituents. In this instance, he actually sees nothing, but Montaigne himself was captured on multiple occasions by traveling the roads in and around Bordeaux, and there were multiple massacres during his lifetime of Protestants by Catholics and Catholics by Protestants. It was une guerre civile that lasted centuries. And why do I bring this up? Why do I bring up the plague and guerre civile? I think it's sort of this, by going back and reading Montaigne in history, it's sort of to draw this connection, a slight connection to some of our own times when we're plagued by COVID-19, when the storming of the Capitol, there's been talk about civil war in our own country. I simply want to draw attention that thinkers of the past have lived through similar moments, and perhaps we can garner some wisdom, like Franklin did, from someone like Montaigne. Okay, so I've suggested that Montaigne is an interesting and important thinker in his own right, but what did he matter in Franklin's time? Well, it turns out he was a really important thinker in Franklin's time. I've given you two quotes. The one on the left is by Nicolas Bricaire de la Dix-Mérie, and he writes an éloge de Montaigne. Remember, I talked about these éloges as something that you write of people who have passed since to sort of raise them onto a pedestal. And this was written at a time when Franklin was ambassador in France, and Franklin actually presided over the event in which this éloge was read out loud. And it basically says that Montaigne was a man who, in designing what is, taught us who we are and instructed us in the science that was known so much later, which is morality. That's a rough translation. But Montaigne was a philosopher. He was a moralist. He taught us what the morals are in the time of plague and in the time of civil war. On the right is an anonymous vindication of Montaigne's essays, actually taken from probably the same edition of Montaigne's essays that Franklin would have read, that basically says people read his book in order to learn how to be virtuous and how to be happy. And so that's what Montaigne could teach us if we're reading Montaigne in the 18th century. And that's exactly what Franklin was doing. So let's go back to Franklin's life. In 1782, we're near the the end of the revolution. The tide is turning towards the Americans. Franklin had printed that fake news report I was telling you because he's upset about all the death and dying. And we see it improve in this letter that he's writing to his friend Joseph Priestley, who in 1782, who's a very famous British scientist. By the way, British, that means they're on opposite sides of the war. They want science to triumph over conflict, but the war has separated them. And he's quoting very deeply Montaigne here. He's reading a passage from Montaigne's essays that Montaigne wrote during the plague years of Bordeaux. And Franklin is really reflecting here. He's reflecting on how proud man is, humankind is, to go to the battlefield and kill and destroy and massacre other people. And he's asking himself if the human race is really worth preserving, and he's doubting of it. So he's doubting of all of the virtues of the American Revolution. He's doubting of everything that the revolution should stand for because of all the killing that's going on. And he does so, and he paraphrases this phrase from Montaigne's essays. Okay, did Montaigne influence Franklin? It's an open question, but here's what happens. Franklin negotiates the Treaty of Paris in 1783. The Treaty of Paris ends the American Revolution. So right at the time when Franklin was doubting, he was reading Montaigne, he was wondering whether all the killing was worth it. The war turned towards the Americans, and Franklin was able to negotiate a peace. And I'm gonna go back to the importance of, or the lack of documentation in the 1776 report of Native American tribes. The 1783 Treaty of Paris was negotiated between France, Britain, and the United States. Spain was a participant, but who was completely absent? Any Native American tribes. None of them were invited to the table, and yet they were important figures in the kaleidoscope and landscape of North America at the time. And so this document that you see before you is a quotation from the Wyandots, the nations of Canada, the Delaware, the Shawnee, the Miamis, the Ottawas, the Chippewas, the Senecas, the Potawatomis, the Conways, the Munseys, the Nantichoks, the Mahicans, the Missougas, the Creeks, the Cherokee, and they're speaking to American commissioners in 1793, so a decade later. And you can see what they say. The Americans had not abided by any of their treaties. The founding of the American nation, what Franklin fought for, ended up in being a land grab of the American Republic. And this quote, I'll leave you a second to read it to yourselves, suggests a very dark story for the future of Native American tribes in the future American democracy. And it ends with, look back and view the lands from whence we have been driven to this spot. We can treat no further because the country behind hardly affords food for its present inhabitants. And we have therefore resolved to leave our bones in this small place to which we are now confined. So at the same time that Franklin was fighting for American democracy, the American Republic was turning its back on Native populations. Now, Franklin's place in all of this is he did, in fact, negotiate the Treaty of Paris. He was very much a pragmatist. So any of you who are looking for a nice and happy story and portrait of Franklin as this story of redemption across his life are going to be disappointed, because that's just not the case. Franklin, towards the end of his life, did become more of an abolitionist. He became sort of the president of a Pennsylvania group of abolitionists, and he writes this petition calling for the end of slavery, and he presents it to Congress in 1790. Congress refuses it. Franklin's relationship with slavery is an interesting and complex one. It turns out, actually, there's a connection with France that I didn't know before I was doing some research on this talk. It's connected to a certain Protestant named Anthony Benezet, who fled France in the early 1700s. He was a Protestant. And so he fled France because with the Edict of Nantes was I'm trying to think of the English word, was repelled? No, it was taken away in the 1598, at the end of Montaigne's era. Montaigne was really important in work on religious toleration. So one of the important things that he did was he contributed to the Edict of Nantes. The Edict of Nantes was a law that basically allowed for religious toleration between Catholics and Protestants in France. A century later, that was signed in 1598. A century later, in 1685, it was taken back. And so you have France again no longer being religiously tolerant. So Protestants were persecuted again. And so the family of Antony-Benezet fled France after their entire property was confiscated by the French regime, and they settled it in North America. And Benezet is one of the prominent North American abolitionists who was in correspondence with Franklin, and according to some scholars had a deep influence starting in 1772 on Franklin's change of thought to become more anti-slavery in his life. It's an interesting connection that I just wanted to draw our attention to. And so we could end our story here. We could talk at the very last of sort of Franklin's complicated story, but I want to go a little bit further and bring us back to Montaigne, because I want to end this on a little bit of hope. And I know we only have 15 minutes left, and so I'm going to go really quickly to leave time for questions. And so here's Henriette Bordick-Viau, who was a correspondent and someone with whom Franklin frequented in his time in France, writing her own Éloge de Montaigne. Roughly, she started writing in 1784. It was published in 1799. So 8 years after the French Revolution or so, actually a little bit more than that. And she's saying that Montaigne, c'est donc Montaigne who gives us the love of a moralist, who inspires us in us virtue. And we have to go back to him and we have to learn from him, because we owe to him almost everything that we admire in all of these treatises on education. Franklin himself wrote his autobiography to try to teach us how to be a virtuous person, but I don't want to go that route, because I don't think that Franklin actually teaches us to be virtuous. I think he's too complicated of a figure. But let's go back to Montaigne just for a second. Let's take Henriette Bordick-Viau's word for it, and let's see what Montaigne has to teach us. And Montaigne has to teach us, and I'm going to actually sort of open my own book. It's my own copy of Montaigne's essays from the 18th century. It's probably the same edition that Franklin himself, it's not Franklin's, but it's probably the edition that he himself would have read, that I found at a local free market. So this is the edition from the 1720s. And if you go to Montaigne's essay on education, on pedantry, he says that mixing with others is wonderfully useful in visiting foreign countries, to bring back knowledge of the characters and ways of those nations, and to rub and polish our brains by contact with those of others. Montaigne is advocating for travel. This in the 16th century, 1600s. And he says this, and this is the quote I want to end on: "This great world is the mirror in which we must look at ourselves to recognize ourselves from the proper angle. In short, I want it to be the book of my student. So many humors, sects, judgments, opinions, laws, and customs teach us to judge sanely of our own, and teach our judgment to recognize its own imperfection and natural weaknesses, which is no small lesson." So Montaigne is advocating us to travel. And why do I end on Montaigne when I started to talk on Franklin? Not just to sort of pay homage to my colleagues at UCEAP, that is all of you, that once this pandemic ends, we will all be able to send students abroad and travel again, but because I think that France and the United States are right now on parallel debates about how do we read our history. In the United States, I started with the 1776 report. It's a very controversial report, and we're still trying to come to terms with our past, with the heritage of slavery and how we understand that. In France, just yesterday, the government said it wants to engage, how do I say this, an investigation of French academia and its relationship with the academic left. And that means those who are interested in questions about colonialism, intersectionality, and race. And they're calling for a broader investigation as how do we draw the line between opinion and research. And for some of those of us who actually are on that research tract of understanding intersectionality and race and the plight of Native populations and colonialism, that is a very, very scary thought that there's going to be an investigation into the actual merit of our scholarship. And so I think that the mixing of American and French students to have these conversations about how do we read and understand history is really important. And so that's one of the reasons that I advocate what all of you do in helping our students broaden their horizons to study abroad. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Here's our virtual claps. I haven't figured out that option here. We so appreciate such an interesting and insightful presentation for probing questions about the past and how that might move us forward. And your presentation, for me, reminds us that though these historical figures or quote heroes can be imperfect and inconsistent, that they can inspire us in a number of ways for each of us to reach our own better selves and in search for a better world, a more harmonious world. So thank you, Daniel, for your inspiration on that. I see in the chat that there are a number of comments, so thank you all for participating in the chat. I see one specific question from Darren, who is our alum from Exeter. Let's see, alum from the year 1989 to 1990. Darren asks, during the American Revolution, the British toyed with an emancipation ideology, promising African Americans liberation in return for military service. Some Americans entertained the same idea, but rejected it. He asks, how did Franklin view this inconsistency in the fight for independence? You want to address that, Daniel?
Yes, thank you for your question. I think Franklin was very much an opportunist and a pragmatist. And so, unfortunately, a lot of his place in history depends on us reading of his letters. So he has a voluminous correspondence. So imagine if all of our emails and Instagram messages and posts on Facebook were somehow available to future scholars who might then use that to track our understanding of events. Some might get lost or deleted, or some might disappear. And so that's the case with Franklin. We have a lot of his correspondence, and it's available in his archives, but not all of it is available. Unfortunately, some of it has been lost over the years. But he was very much interested in the American cause of independence. And so there are some instances in which he expressed a willingness to entertain greater freedom for African Americans, but at the same time was willing to compromise on that if it meant ending the war and gaining what he considered the greater good of American independence. And so understanding Franklin's shift towards an anti-slavery thinker is a challenging prospect, because a lot of what he expresses comes later in his life, when the revolution has been won, and when he's back in Pennsylvania and he's part of this Quaker group. So he was greatly influenced by the Quakers, trying to push for the end of slavery and greater rights, and actually has a treatise on education for freed slaves, and that comes starting around 1787. One of his last acts was to present it before Congress in 1790, and then he died a few months later. But when the American Revolution was ongoing, he was really more of a pragmatist. And this shows some of the complexity and the moral failings, I would say, of Franklin, that he was willing to put the quote unquote future of America over the ideals that it represented when push came to shove. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. A number of different comments. I do want to read one comment from John, who's alum in 2016 Korea. You're very talented at picking apart the figures in a historically fair manner, especially in respect to peoples other than of European backgrounds. You should continue. I felt free, John says. Darren, thanks for the answer that you just gave and raised a different question. How do we view historical personages past who did great things, but under today's moral don't pass the test? Think Churchill and Franklin, even Gandhi. Is being woke iconoclastic, or can we distinguish that these people were products of their time?
I mean, that's the ultimate question. I mean, it's a great question. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I'll go back to what the 1776 report says. It basically asks us to whitewash history and say that we should accept these figures at sort of the historical value, that they were figures that were above their time and beyond their time, and we shouldn't criticize them. I actually think that's the wrong approach to take. I think that we need to go back and try to grapple with these figures for two reasons. The first is, someone like Franklin is interesting because one can ask, why does he shift from being someone who owns slaves to someone who becomes, at the end of his life, an anti-slave advocate? So what happens during his lifetime? There's some sense in which it's because he sees a shifting of the tide, and maybe it can be to his advantage, but there's also something moral going on in his mind. And so understanding how someone across their life journey can shift, I think, is really interesting and important. I think the other, perhaps even more important reason is the questions that are raised by actually going back and investigating these questions. And so one might ask, like, why give a talk on Benjamin Franklin during African History Month, like Black History Month? Why do that? And I think the answer becomes because of the conversations that we have around it. And I think in my own family, so one of the conversations we had at dinner tonight, it's nighttime in France, and so we had dinner. So I asked, like, my daughter, like, what do you know about the American presidents? And, you know, she was able to list a couple of them. Like, how many of them own slaves? And she's like, well, what do you mean own slaves? What does that mean? And so, like, I sort of went through the list, and we had this broader conversation. We did some historical research and found all these different resources that are available, which we never would have looked into had I not just engaged this subject. And so one of the important things of going back to the past is all the different pathways of investigation, of critical investigation that goes up. And I want to share the next slide with you. Can you still see? Am I still sharing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's a slide of how I teach the Enlightenment. So I'm a professor of political theory, which is political philosophy. And thanks to UCEAP, a shout out to you, I've been able to design a class with French students and UC students from Irvine and San Diego about teaching the Enlightenment through critical narratives. Online, it's a virtual exchange, so we're not together, but we're still together in a Zoom environment. And this is one of the opening slides I start with, that this is how we need to read the Enlightenment. And Charles Mills is a famous American philosopher who talks about the racial contract, and so we need to understand the social contract, which is the foundation of American democracy and French democracy, through the lens of race. And then Louis Salamolins, who says that we can only understand the Enlightenment through the Code Noir, which is the legal book of slavery in the 17th century. And so I think that for me, if we start to engage these historical thinkers who are held up on this pedestal, we're going to see some of their contradictions, and it opens up a path of inquiry to bring us back to Montaigne, to help us inquire about our own assumptions about what we think we know about our own morality, and maybe come to terms with some of our own biases about history, about our place in society, and about where we can contribute to greater social cohesion. And that's one of the reasons that I go to look back at history. It's not to, well, and I'll stop there.
All right, thank you so much. It's an excellent place to stop because one,